In today's video, we have some updates on some NHL trade rumors, plus we also have some other interesting news and notes regarding the NHL Global Series and the potential salary cap for next year's season. All that coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, we have a variety of news and notes to discuss here today, but first I want to get started with some updates on some NHL trade rumors. Now a couple of these guys are players we've discussed here a few times in the past, and some of it is a little bit new. Either way, we have some updated information. Now most of the information I'm discussing in today's video is courtesy of Elliotte Friedman's and his 31 Thoughts blog and podcast. If you're not already following Elliotte Friedman on Twitter and other social media outlets, I highly recommend it. The 31 Thoughts podcast and blog, it gives a lot of great information and certainly helps kind of create a lot of insight in things that I use in a lot of my videos here as well. So certainly recommend you check that out if you haven't already. Now first up, I want to discuss Columbus Blue Jackets star winger Artemi Panarin. Now as we know, the circus around Panarin has kind of been going on throughout the entire offseason. Back when it was first revealed that Panarin wasn't interested in signing a contract extension with the Columbus Blue Jackets. We've heard lots of different things since that period of time, and as of right now, nothing has really changed with the fact that he does not want to sign an extension and doesn't really want to discuss it any further throughout the season. Now, the information from Elliotte Friedman that he talked about in his 31 Thoughts blog indicates that he feels Artemi Panarin is going to be the next John Tavares. Now, next offseason, near the end of June, you're going to be seeing Panarin basically having a lineup of meetings like Tavares did with a variety of teams, kind of deciding his future and his fate, meeting with these teams, determining where the best fit is, who's going to pay him the most money, etc. Now, it's still believed that there's a handful of preferred destinations by the Panarin camp. Now, this is just speculation, of course, until we hear it from Panarin, and he's not going to discuss that at this point, or probably never will publicly. It's believed that the teams in New York, like the Rangers and the Islanders, as well as the LA Kings, Tampa Bay Lightning, like he wants to play in a bigger market. There's a lot more attention. There's also some speculation he really wants to play in a warm climate. So obviously places like LA and Tampa would be favorable as well. I don't think you could completely rule out maybe the other California teams either. However, that's really all we really know about his apparent preference of place to play at this point in his career. Obviously, next year as a UFA, he'll have all kinds of options and choices. There will be lots of interest in this player as he's a very dynamic, very offensively gifted player. As we know, though, teams might shy away from his asking price depending on what that turns out to be. I do think it's going to probably be at least somewhere around $9 to $10 million. It could possibly be more. A lot of that will likely be determined by how well this season goes and what kind of production he puts up during the 18-19 season. But with all that in mind, you got to wonder what the Columbus Blue Jackets are going to do here. If they're in a playoff push, are they going to want to trade their top offensive player? Probably not. So they could possibly use him as their own form of a rental, basically, instead of trading him and getting back a diminished return, basically like we saw with the Senators and Erik Karlsson. Even though it was before training camp and the season was just getting underway, he did not agree to a contract extension with the Sharks. So the Sharks are only guaranteed to have him for the current season only. So he basically is a rental. I mean, mind you, it's a longer period of time than you see at the deadline, but he's still a rental nonetheless. So the Sharks are taking a chance that they are going to be able to re-sign him, but that's certainly diminished what the return was to the Ottawa Senators, and the same is going to be had for Panarin and the Blue Jackets. Now, I would think that the Blue Jackets will likely hang on to Panarin until closer to the trade deadline, see how things go. I'm sure there's still a little bit of optimism internally that they might be able to convince him to stay and sign an extension. However, that really seems unlikely in my opinion. I think he's all but gone. It's just a matter of time and a matter of determining where he goes next and where that's going to be. But I think if the Blue Jackets are smart, I think in some ways they should trade him, and there's certainly an argument to be had keeping him as their own rental. If the return isn't going to be sufficient enough, then you might as well keep him, make it run as best you can, and hope for the best next offseason. But they very well could end up like the Islanders did with John Tavares and end up losing out on their star player, which is really unfortunate for a franchise who's trying to make some steps forward here, win their first playoff series, and really take the team in that forward direction. This is certainly not going to help matters with their playoff aspirations and trying to move forward here and become more of a cup contender. That is for certain. But if they do make a trade, I think the teams that keep your eyes out for, like I mentioned all along, the big one to me is the San Jose Sharks. Now, they've already landed Karlsson, but they do have some room that they could add another player. So I do think the Sharks are a team to watch. I'm not going to say for sure they're going after Panarin. I don't have information to suggest that. But I do have information to suggest that I've read before that the Sharks are not completely sold here on being done. They do have a lot of youth in their lineup, more than expected this year, and they very well could add in another veteran type of player with a lot of offensive production to try to put themselves over the top here to see how things go. I mean, they've had a little bit of a rough start so far, kind of still working out the kinks, having a guy like Karlsson in their lineup along with Burns. The power play is kind of struggling to kind of find its way, but I'm sure they'll get that figured out. They have just way too much talent not to. But the Sharks are certainly a team to keep your eye on. Now, keep in mind that Artemi Panarin does lack trade protection. So if the Blue Jackets do decide that they are going to move him, it's really within their full control and not his. And really, I don't think he'd be completely opposed to being traded, and then he'll enter free agency over the summer. But because of everything that he said and holding his ground firm, that he's not doing an extension during the season, I think it's safe to say that he's definitely would be traded as a rental. Elliot Friedman also went on a few tidbits here about Calgary Flames forward Sam Bennett. Now, we discussed Sam Bennett in the last video where we discussed trade rumors as a player to keep your eye on that the Flames might kind of grow impatient with and decide to finally move on from. Yes, Sam Bennett is a pretty decent player, but he's nowhere near the highly touted forward he was drafted to be. He was a really high draft pick, came into the league with a lot of promise and potential, and even though he's kind of showing his value of being an NHL player, he's not near the level that was expected of him. So obviously because of that, teams sometimes will go frustrated and find a trade to get him a fresh start and kind of recoup what they can. But I guess he's still pretty young, so they're still concerned that if they trade him, he'll find that game with another team that they're hoping he would find with them. So Elliot Friedman's point here is they think the Flames are going to hang on to Sam Bennett for the season. He needs a new contract after this year anyway. See how things go, and if the season does not go all that well, maybe next offseason they'll look to maybe find him a fresh start. But it looks as though Sam Bennett likely stays with the Flames throughout this year, at least. I mean, if the Flames fall out of contention, though, for a playoff spot, I think there's a possibility near the deadline. But it looks as though Sam Bennett may be hanging around with the Flames a little bit longer. The Vancouver Canucks have apparently received a lot of interest in defenseman Alex Edler. Now, the 32-year-old Swedish defenseman, he's been with the Canucks a long time. He's been full-time with them since 2007. So he's, had a lot of mileage, a lot of experience, but he's certainly still be one of their more productive guys on the back end, for sure. Certainly one of their better puck movers, gets a lot of power play time. He's been playing a lot of minutes, well over 20, closer to 24, 25 minutes a night here to start the 18-19 season. And he's still young enough that I think he could also be a good role model for the Canucks. However, where they were getting a lot of interest, he's made it perfectly clear, apparently, that he has no interest in leaving Vancouver, and he does have a no-trade clause. So it is possible the Canucks may approach him later on, possibly near the deadline for a trade. But Alex Edler, even though he's getting lots of interest, he can obviously veto any trades. Now, of course, one thing to keep in mind, he could be traded and then re-sign with the Canucks during the offseason because he is going into the final year of his deal here. So he will be an unrestricted free agent next offseason. But as we've seen before with the Vancouver Canucks, they were very reluctant to part ways with the Sedins. They very well could have gone to them with a trade proposal last year to obviously finish their careers out elsewhere. Maybe give them a chance to win a Stanley Cup. But between how the team felt about it as well as the players, they'd opted against that. They wanted to end things in Vancouver and didn't want to move on from their players and recoup assets, even though a lot of other teams may have looked at things differently. And he is a guy that's getting a lot of interest on the trade market, but it seems unlikely that he'll want to accept a trade anywhere this year. He does seem to be pretty hard and steady on staying in Vancouver. Now, quickly touch a base here on Maple Leafs forward William Nylander. There really isn't much news to report on as far as the contract stalemate, I guess we'll call, between Nylander and the Maple Leafs. So it's hard to say how long this plays out. As I mentioned before, I do think the longer it goes, the harder it's going to be to recover and come to an agreement. It could result in possibly being a trade. And maybe they can work out a deal too on a shorter term basis, which seems unlikely because neither side kind of seems to want that. but it might be the only real solution. If they go long enough here as a stalemate, they may have to come to an agreement on a shorter term deal, because I do think at some point here the Leafs are going to face a cap crunch, as we've discussed before. They've got some other big contracts to do, and I totally understand from Nylander's standpoint, this is his long-term livelihood here. If he takes a lower contract and then sees what Marner and Matthews gets, and it's going to hurt. And so every time you see a player sign, the next one you see a sign after, they usually get more because everything's changing every year. But the real no news to update on that. It was still a bit of a stalemate between Nylander and the Leafs. Now, speaking of the cap crunch that the Leafs are going to face, they're certainly not the only team in this situation. There's plenty of other teams as well. Another good example would be the Winnipeg Jets, who have a lot of young talent due for new contract extensions either this year or next, and they're going to be getting handsome raises and therefore putting a lot of pressure on the team, creating a lot of hard decisions on how do you keep them all together if you can. I mean, we've seen many teams win the Stanley Cups and have to dismantle to a degree because it's costly to have such a strong team, and it's just really difficult to satisfy all their contractual needs and what they all deserve to be paid. Now, we do have some early reports here from Elliotte Friedman in his latest blog talking about what the salary cap could possibly project to next year. This has come from their latest Board of Governors meetings. Discussed the latest NHL Board of Directors meetings not long ago when we were discussing the Seattle franchise. The Seattle group met with the executive committee shortly before the main Board of Governor meeting. So a lot of this other information is coming from that meeting, which was just here in the past week. But they did discuss early projections for next year's salary cap, which they have ranging between $81.4 million and $85.4 million, with the upper end of that being a full 5% increase, which is usually the max that we normally see year over year. If we end up at the lower end of that, though, it's not going to give teams a whole lot more flexibility next year compared to this, so the teams facing the cap crunch are not going to get a ton of help that way. In relation to the salary cap, though, and player salaries constantly rising, it kind of brings to another discussion of a potential lockout or a new CBA being negotiated here in the near future as well. As we've discussed before, you're probably aware of the NHL as well as the NHLPA both have an option in 2019 in September to opt out of the current CBA, which would then have it expire the year later in 2020. If neither side's to opt out early, the eventual expiry is in 2022. So could we have a work stoppage after either one of those dates, depending if they opt out or not? Now, I do think the potential expansion here to Seattle will likely have a big impact on that as well. From the players' perspective, a couple of the big kind of things that are on the table here for discussion that they're probably not pleased with is the amount of money that goes to escrow as well as Olympic participation. And I'm sure from the owner's standpoint, they're probably always concerned, as always they usually are, around the ever-increasing player salaries, etc. So as the salaries go up, as the salary cap goes up, the amount of the players kind of go in their escrow goes up as well, because it's a percentage of their salaries. So one thing that the NHLPA has as well is the salary cap escalator clause, which they can use to increase the salary cap every season. So as they continue to use that clause to kind of help get their players make more money, they're also helping them pay more in escrow, which is kind of a major concern for them as well. Some key things to keep your eye on, but as of right now, it does look like there is a potential for a 5% increase on the salary cap next year. Of course, that's not guaranteed. We'll see how revenues go. Now, one last piece of news here I want to discuss was the NHL Global Series. Now, we saw a few teams go over to China to play some preseason games this year. We also saw the Oilers and the Bruins go over to Europe. Obviously, they did some preseason games as well as a regular season game in Sweden. We saw a regular season game last year in Sweden as well between the Avalanche and Senators. So it does seem like the NHL is trying hard to obviously to grow the game globally, which is having a nice impact on the amount of players that we're seeing to come from all different parts of the world now. Certainly helping grow the sport internationally. It does appear that the NHL is not only interested in returning to China for future games, but they're interested in going perhaps with more teams and for regular season games, not just for the preseason. It was mentioned in Elliotte Friedman's 31 Thoughts blog that it does appear that the NHL is interested in possibly sending 4 teams instead of 2 so that they could have a game set up in 2 different locations and the teams don't have to travel around as much. Obviously, as we know, the teams can kind of get more settled and get more comfortable if they can stay in one place a little bit longer. So they'd have 2 teams go to one city and another 2 teams go to another city. They'd have more time to practice and then put on a regular season game. You can't help but wonder how the players would feel about this. Traveling to China is a big deal. It's a major difference, in as far as the time zones, culture, etc. To go over there for an extended period of time and play meaningful games that count towards their regular season. It's hard to say if that's something they're going to want to do or not. I know the regular season games played over in Europe has been, relatively successful for sure. But certainly will be interesting to see how they proceed with this. But if you've been watching the NHL Global Series and kind of watching them go around mostly through Europe into China, I'd like to hear your comments down below. What do you think about the NHL maybe going back to China next year, or in the near future at least, with 4 teams and having multiple games played over there for the regular season? So that's all of our news and notes and NHL rumors for today. So, of course, leave your comments down below. Let me know what your thoughts are on all this. I'd love to hear your comments so we can discuss further down in the comments section. If you're new to the channel here, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button as well. I'd really appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.